Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on planning procurement management. Part 2. As you're planning procurement and developing your procurement management plan, it's a good idea to think about all of the things that could go wrong and to have plans in place to deal with those. Some of these would be preventive actions that you can take, and some would be corrective actions if these things happen. So let's take a look at some of the more common things that you should watch out for, caveats that you should be aware of and prepare for. One of the more common things to watch out for is when you have stakeholders who already have their minds made up. They already have a preconceived idea of how the project should proceed, what its strategy should be, its development approach, and they may even have an idea or a decision made in their minds of which vendors or vendor that should be selected. This can happen when you have stakeholders who have relationships with vendors. This is especially dangerous when you have very powerful high-level stakeholders that have long-term relationships with certain vendors. Another problem that you can find is that stakeholders can't agree on the selection criteria for how you're going to choose which vendor. Some stakeholders will favor choosing based on price and choosing the bid that comes in the lowest. Others will be more focused on quality, and others may be more focused on the schedule. Another thing to be careful of is to make sure that the process doesn't take too long. It can easily take many months to go through the procurement process, and that can be a little exhausting for your key stakeholders. And it can also open up the window of opportunity for stakeholders to make up their own minds and decide they'd just rather go with one vendor or another and not really follow the process. So it's important to prepare people for how long this process could take, but also important to see what you can do to minimize how long it takes. If you're working with an organization that favors or requires fixed price contracts and going with the lowest bidder, then you need to be especially careful, because you may well find yourself in a situation later on in which you need to make some changes, and those changes can be very expensive. It's very common for vendors to realize that you're in this situation and to bid low, very low, in fact, so low that they're not making any profit, and to anticipate and expect that there will be changes and to have a pretty high price tag on what it costs to make changes, and thereby making up for their loss and ending up making quite a nice profit on the project. Also, this can be an invitation for poor quality. So if you're not very careful about your quality requirements, you may end up with a level of quality that you're not really happy with, even though it is technically satisfying the terms of the contract. You'll also need to be careful of having an incomplete procurement statement of work. You need to make sure that it's as complete as possible, especially if you're dealing with a fixed price contract, not only so that bidders can bid accurately, but also so that you don't have these expensive change requests later on. And here are some more caveats or things to watch out for. One is false statements made in vendor responses. Vendors, some of them, have a tendency to exaggerate or to gloss over things that they don't think will really matter. Also watch for bait and switch. Some vendors will provide you with certain information about specific resources, whether team members or other resources, that are very favorable and provide a very good review and evaluation, But then when it comes time to actually doing the work, those resources are conveniently not available and they substitute in other, less qualified resources. If your procurement is highly dependent on having the right specific resources, then make sure you lock them down on that. Another thing to watch for is incomplete contract terms and conditions. Vendors that don't follow the terms of the contract, some of them go into this knowing that they're not going to follow all the terms of the contract, and they figure that it will be too late by the time this gap is recognized, and it'll be too late to make a change to switch to some other vendor. You'll also need to be careful to avoid vendors that either can't or don't do the job properly. And on your end, you may find that some of your key stakeholders are requesting far too many changes. They may be disappointed that initially some of the requirements that they wanted to have included were not included, and they may try to add those later on during the course of the project. Perhaps the most important thing you can do to prevent some of these kinds of problems is to make sure you have very good stakeholder engagement. Err on the side of caution here. Engage with your stakeholders more than you think is necessary. It's critical that you get stakeholder buy-in and critical that you understand the real needs and requirements of these different stakeholders. If you don't make the effort up front to really understand the stakeholders and their needs, then you're likely to be surprised later on in the project when you find out that what you've contracted for isn't sufficient and you need to make changes that are costly to do later on in the project. One of the best ways to handle a situation in which you have stakeholders that can't agree on what's most important when it comes to selecting a vendor is to use multi-criteria selection. You'll have some stakeholders that focus on cost as being the most important, others that are more focused on quality, others on schedule or the viability of the company that you are considering. If you take all of the different factors that people are really interested in and discuss them and put them into a weighted averaging formula or multi-criteria selection matrix, this will usually resolve the issue because then all of the stakeholders will feel that they've been heard and that their most important features or criteria are included in the decision-making process. So far, every time I've used this, it's been quite successful in getting entrenched stakeholders to buy into the results not only of the matrix or selection criteria, but also in the final output. And when it generates its final results, they're accepted without any disputes. Next on the list of preventive measures is expert judgment, particularly in the areas of facilitation and conflict resolution, which can help you to resolve conflicts of differences of opinion and different requirements from different stakeholders. Next, we have the need for a complete procurement statement of work. And the best way to get that is to start with a complete work breakdown structure. It may be advisable for you to actually have a separate project to go through the processes of collecting requirements, defining scope, creating the WBS, and plan procurement management. And this way, you can give it the proper amount of attention to make sure that you really do have a complete procurement statement of work before you rush into the process of procurement. And finally, we have the need for a complete and unambiguous statement of work. Part of making sure that this is quite clear is to review it yourself, as well as to engage experts in statements of work, including your team members, key stakeholders, and making sure that they all buy into the fact that this statement of work is complete and unambiguous. And we have yet more to discuss regarding preventive measures that you can take. An important one is to make sure you pick the right type of delivery and contract for the type of work that you're asking for. You should consider whether you should be following an Agile approach or a predictive approach, and whether you should be using fixed price, cost plus, or time and materials types of contracts, as well as the many different types of delivery such as design build or design build operate. You should also beware of fixed price contracts and the requirements to attract or to accept the lowest bidder. And make sure that you have a complete statement of work and very detailed quality requirements if you are required to use a fixed price contract and select the lowest bidder. The next suggestion is to make sure that you pick a reputable vendor that is a good match for your organization and for your project. And if there are any key resources that were proposed, make sure that those same key resources are part of the actual project and that you don't suffer from a bait and switch situation. You should also make sure that the contract itself is complete and unambiguous. Now, you may not be a legal expert, but you should go ahead and review it yourself. You may spot some things that are specifically related to the scope and concerns of your project that go beyond legal requirements that you can find and have corrected before they become a problem. You'll also need to engage expert advice by having this contract reviewed by the appropriate people in your procurement department or your legal counsel. You should also make sure that all of the bidders are aware of all of the contract terms and accept each one of them. And this can be done during your bidders conference. And you'll also need to make sure you have excellent change management and control in order to do things like controlling scope creep. One suggestion I have for you that I have used successfully in the past is to actually introduce a fee for submitting a change request. Otherwise, you and others on your team can become inundated with lots of changes that ultimately get rejected, and then you have no compensation for the time and money that you've spent evaluating all of those change requests. And by having a fee, you can help to discourage an undue number of change requests. And you'll also need to have very strong support from your sponsor in enforcing strictly your change management processes. Now let's talk about corrective actions. What do you do when you've taken all the preventive actions that were reasonable, but you still end up with a problem when you're actually working on the project and working with a vendor? The first thing you should do is confront the problem right away and don't delay and don't hope that it will get better. Confront it immediately. Make sure that you include all the right people in your discussions. If necessary, use mediation to come to an agreement. And make sure that you provide very clear requirements of what is expected of the vendor as a result of mediation. And you may also want to consider minimizing your exposure and your risk during this period of time. Until the vendor gets things back on track, you may want to delay certain activities and minimize your expenses so that if things don't work out or if you need more mediation or discussion, that you haven't spent a lot of time and money on things that might turn out to be a waste. I also recommend that you have zero tolerance for vendors who make false claims, do bait and switch, or who won't follow the terms of the contract. If you tolerate this kind of bad behavior, it will only encourage more of this bad behavior from them and from other vendors, and will put you into a very weak position later on in the project when things get worse and worse. It's far better to switch horses, in other words, to switch vendors, sooner rather than later, because it's a lot more painful than you think to continue. We're generally far too optimistic about how well we'll be able to turn things around once we're in a relationship with a vendor. I've seen bad relationships that go on for far too long. It's one thing to have a frank conversation about a problem and get it resolved. But it's another when you find out that you can't trust them, or you find out that they aren't nearly as competent as you thought. We all want to give people who are acting in good faith a chance to fix things, and we should. But it's a waste of time to struggle with someone who is not acting in good faith. So it's important to make that distinction. Does this vendor just need some help and to fix a few things, or are they a vendor that you really can't trust? Inputs to this process include high-level information from the project charter, alignment information from the business case to make sure your procurement strategy is aligned, the expected timing of your benefits from the benefits management plan, how to manage vendor scope coming from the scope management plan, the quality standards that you'll need for the contract from your quality management plan, which resources you need to procure from your resource management plan, and your procurement statement of work will be based on your scope baseline. You also have deadlines from your milestone list and information about the resources you need from your project team assignments and resource requirements, details about your requirements from your requirements documentation and requirements traceability matrix, information in your risk register that can affect what type of contract you use and how much you want to transfer risk to the vendor, and your stakeholder register, which contains information about regulatory, procurement, and legal personnel that can help you. The marketplace conditions and the different sellers and their offerings that are out there will also affect you. Terms and conditions for contracts, the legal and regulatory requirements and advice that you can get, and different systems out there that can help you to manage it, as well as your organization's pre-approved seller lists, policies, procedures, guidelines, and supported contract types. The tools and techniques include expert judgment, market research, make or buy analysis, your source selection analysis and all of its different forms that it can take, and, of course, meetings. How much do you remember of the inputs, outputs, tools, and techniques? There are several outputs: the procurement management plan, procurement strategy, bid documents, the procurement statement of work, the source selection criteria, make or buy decisions, independent cost estimates, change requests, and all sorts of updates are possible to project documents and even organizational process assets. Inputs come from all over the place, anywhere where you can gain information about the requirements, the resources needed, scheduling, costs, quality, and so on. Tools and techniques, that list is relatively short. You have expert judgment, market research, make or buy analysis, some source selection analysis, and meetings. Online tools make it much easier these days to advertise for and submit bids. We also have the growing use of standards, as well as an increased emphasis on identifying and clearly assigning in the contract responsibility for specific risks. More international standards are being developed and adopted to ease procurement on very large projects. More globalization is fueling better international logistics and supply chain management. Some large procurements require months or even years of lead time, such as for some of the heavy equipment in the mining industry. And procurement processes are adapting to order such items early on, without waiting for the rest of the project and procurement plans to be finalized. Webcams have been introduced on construction sites to improve transparency and improve safety and security. And some are experimenting with trial engagements in which multiple candidate sellers are engaged in parallel to work on some of the project's early deliverables, after which one of them is selected for the rest of the project. Collaborative partnerships are not new or unique to Agile, but in projects with a high degree of uncertainty, for which an Agile approach is or can be used, collaborative partnerships are a great way to share the risks and benefits. Larger projects may be divided into multiple parts, with the high uncertainty parts managed using an Agile or adaptive approach, while the more predictable parts are managed using a predictive development approach. This lesson has covered procurement's make or buy decision, the procurement statement of work, procurement strategy, including delivery methods and contract types, the bid documents, soliciting and evaluating bids, as well as the caveats and some of the prevention and correction steps that you can take. And finally, a brief review of the inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs. For more information, you can refer to these pages of the PMBOK guide. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.